Good afternoon, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Eric Nelson, and we have a really good session scheduled for you just before lunch hour here. And we're going to look at dietary patterns, research, evidence, and policy implications for the 2020 to 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And I'm not going to spend any more time introducing the subject matter. I hope that the panelists will get to it. But first up, we have Dr. Edward Giovannucci, who comes to us from the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard. And he's going to be talking to us about challenges and opportunities for dietary patterns in research, cancer research. So without further ado, Dr. Giovannucci, take it away.
Hello. Hi. Can you see my slides? Hello?
Not yet. No, we can't.
Not yet? Okay. Let's see. I'm doing share screen. Let's see. We'll try this one. Can you see now?
Yep.
Yeah, you're good.
Great. Okay. So I'll go to right from the beginning. It's kind of weird.
Yes.
You can see I'm right. I'm doing, I don't know why slide. Oh, here, okay.
Do you have
finally
two slides? Okay, yeah.
Yep, finally got it. Okay, thank you for inviting me, and I'm glad I finally got it going here. So it's a pleasure to talk about the challenges and opportunities for dietary patterns in cancer research. I'll do this in 20 minutes this morning. For those of you that were in the morning session, we saw a nice presentation on how the WCRF, AICR come up with the recommendations. And this is a list of the 10 so-called commandments. Now, I won't go through all of these, and obviously the important ones at the top are a healthy weight and being physically active. But the focus today will be more on the specific foods. And of course, the foods have an impact on the body weight and also on independent effects. Now, it is believed that overall diet, including energy balance, so the effects of diet through energy balance, might account for 20 to 30% of total cancers, depending on which estimates you believe. But it's a substantial proportion of the cancers. Now, what's interesting is of the established dietary factors, about 4 to 5% of the total cancers are preventable by optimizing intake. And again, this is independently of energy balance. So this is talking mainly about dietary pattern. And there may be additional effects through energy balance and obesity, but we're focusing on pattern. While this is important, it seems relatively small, particularly compared to the 20, 30% of totals. Now, are we missing a substantial proportion of the dietary effect by examining individual items? Now, I think there's, if you look at the AICR, WCRF recommendations, I think there's implicit, it just, even though they're listed as 10 recommendations, they're really meant to be taken as a package. So for example, this is a quote directly, the individual recommendations form a package that taken together direct people towards healthy patterns of diet and physical activity. People do not eat foods in isolation, but in combination, forming an overall diet. Different components of the diet interact with one another, so the impact of one factor may be influenced by another. We are confident that following all the recommendations offer more protection than just following just one. So this leads us to what I would say is the basic rationale to study dietary patterns in cancer research. Here's 3 points. The whole diet would better pick up additive and synergistic effects than looking at individual items. So, and also many small effects may add up to a substantial one. Looking at dietary patterns inherently accounts for substitution. So if you're eating a certain set of foods, then by definition you're avoiding others that may be deleterious. So it's better to look at the whole dietary pattern, what you're eating, which it really tells you also what you're not eating in a sense. And it's easier to translate and communicate to people. Sometimes when we focus too much on single nutrients, it's caused a lot of confusion, like high-fat diets. So from a research perspective, which I'm going to really focus on, there are three main approaches to dietary patterns. There's the indices or scores that are based on prior knowledge. Then there are the empirically derived from dietary data of the study population. There are many techniques. The most commonly used is principal components analysis. And then there is hypothesis-oriented, which is looking at specific components of the diet. So I'm going to talk briefly about all three and see how they're interrelated. So I think many of you know specific dietary patterns, and this is a summary from a paper by Fred Tabung, 2017. And obviously I'm not going to spend time on all of these in detail, but these are just to give you a sense: Healthy Eating Index, Alternative Healthy Eating Index, DASH, and the Mediterranean, for example. I think most people are aware of these. And you can see that there's a lot of overlap. The foods that we think are beneficial, so you generally get higher points for these foods and lower points or points taken away for these foods. There's a lot of concordance, but there are some differences on how, like, for example, low-fat dairy, fish is weighed differently. And then there are some that are very a little bit more complicated, such as alcohol. The M here means moderate intake is actually given positive points. So there is definitely some overlap, but also some discordance. And then that's summarized here, that there is a lot of overlap among the dietary patterns, but they vary in how they treat certain items like alcohol, salt, dairy, animal proteins other than red meat. Certain items are pretty consistent: red meat, sugar-sweetened beverages, for example, usually deleterious, fruits and vegetables, whole grains, typically beneficial. So these, they're correlated, the commonly used dietary patterns, and the correlations are around 0.6 to 0.7. So they're decently correlated, but certainly there are differences. I think an important thing to really note is that really most of these are focused on cardiovascular disease risk reduction, focusing on things like lipids, sugars, blood pressure. DASH diet, for example, is specifically for hypertension. And any association with cancer would be a secondary benefit. Now, this is not really too surprising if you look at, go back in history. About 50 years ago, 40 years ago, these are absolute number of deaths, and heart disease outnumbered cancer deaths almost 3 to 1. But you can see the increases in heart disease up to about 1970 and 80 flattened out for various reasons, which I won't get into in great detail, whereas cancer has gone up. Remember, these are absolute numbers. So these are also, taken, incorporate just the aging of the population and the larger size of the population. But when it's 3 to 1 cardiovascular, you could emphasize cardiovascular disease more. But now I think cancer we have to take a little bit more into account. Now, this slide, sorry, it's a little confusing, but just focus on the summary. And I won't get into detail, but just kind of shows you the importance of cardiovascular disease in the recommendations. This is a network meta-analysis of randomized trials. And I won't go into detail, but it compares these foods against each other. And they actually looked at about 10 different biomarkers like LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, CRP for inflammation, and I won't list them all. And sort of like using this clever approach, they rank the foods relative to each other, like which is better for looking at all of these put together. So the summary links the food. So nuts comes out number one here, whole grains, legumes, fish, fruits, vegetables, refined grains, red meat, eggs, dairy, sugar, beverages. It's not like too surprising, and I think most of us would have some, conception of this ranking. And if you look at the individual factors, like some are better than others for certain things, but this is a summary. And this looks very much like the whole dietary pattern. I also just want to know that like fruits and vegetables are good for cardiovascular and cancer. But it's important to note the magnitude of the protective association between total fruits and vegetables is about 3 times stronger for coronary heart disease and 5 times stronger for stroke than it is for total cancer. So it's not to say that fruits and vegetables are not good for cancer, but the magnitude is about 5 times weaker than it is for stroke, which kind of makes sense because probably a lot of the benefit of fruits and vegetables is through blood pressure. So these patterns are good for cancer, but they're really focus on heart disease. I'm going to talk about briefly empirically derived dietary patterns. And again, I won't go into detail about the methods. They often, they're based on population, like a cohort study, for example, and they use principal components analysis, which tries to sort of classify the foods that tend to be eaten together. And what happened, it was kind of interesting, and this is also from Fred Tabone's summary in 2007. And he looked at different populations. This study was focused on colorectal cancer. And what's interesting is that you see, and these just emerged from the data. These are not based on prior knowledge. So, but we call a healthy dietary pattern, an unhealthy dietary pattern emerges in the population. So people who tend to eat fruits, tend to eat vegetables more often. And then, so, it's kind of just some people tend to have a healthy dietary pattern, and some people unhealthy dietary pattern. And it's kind of interesting, even in these relatively diverse populations, there's a lot of commonality, but there's also some items that only show up in some populations and not the others. So there is reasonable concordance in derived dietary patterns across diverse countries, though we do need more studies, broader populations. And in most populations, completely empirically, 2 general dietary patterns emerge: unhealthy, which call Western, and a healthy dietary pattern. Now, if you look at more components, other dietary patterns emerge, and sometimes they're hard to interpret, but most of them do show this kind of healthy and unhealthy dietary pattern. Now, the differences that we see across populations, it could be real differences, but they could also be differences in some of the methods and the questionnaires, how the foods are grouped, and a lot of these affect the different foods that fall into different patterns. So some foods that may not fall in some patterns, it could possibly just that the way they group the food items, or that specific food was missing. But it's important to think that these different dietary patterns, if you want to come up with a standard generalizable statement, you have to consider the differences in populations. Now, it's also interesting to know how correlated these dietary patterns are. And I just use data here from the Nurses' Health Study, but probably similar in other studies. That if you look at the prudent diet, for example, that comes out completely empirically, it correlates from about 0.5 to 0.8 with standard dietary patterns. So people are these dietary patterns sometimes give us relatively similar information, but the correlations are not 1.0. So So there are differences. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is what I call the hypothesis-oriented. And these are like focusing on specific mechanisms that may be related to cancer. Now, I include this slide to make a point here, and this is obviously a big simplification, but I think this is approximately correct. I mean, so I'm looking at three main pathways here: blood pressure, lipids, and glucose, insulin, things related to that, and inflammation, just closely related. And if you think about it, when you go to your primary care doctor, the things that they always measure: blood pressure, lipids, things like glucose. So these are standard, and we know that they're important. And the dietary factors that affect them are overlap or are somewhat different. So fruits and vegetables, for example, things like potassium, sodium, are more important for blood pressure. Fats in the diet are more important for the lipids, excuse me. And then the dietary patterns that increase insulin secretion, inflammation, which I'll talk about, are again, overlap, but are important, are different. What I want to focus here is that for cancer, this is the pathway that I think potentially may be more important. Not to say that these other factors are not important, but I think those are more focused on cardiovascular disease. So just like, how do we determine, there are different ways to determine these hypothesis-based pathways. And actually, there are some approaches that are using prior knowledge, like the dietary inflammatory index. So there are different ways to approach the hypothesis-based dietary pattern, but this is one approach which is entirely empirical. And this is just using biomarkers, like this is one study that we did in multiple cohorts. So the findings are actually pretty robust, which we basically, it's entirely based on predicting biomarkers, C-peptide or inflammatory markers. And so foods are just entered in a model. And this is a simple summary of the results. And again, it's kind of interesting. So these are the foods that a plus means that it's tends to increase insulin or inflammation markers like CRP. And you see a lot of commonality with the other dietary patterns, like red and processed meat always seem to be big winners or losers in these analyses. But there are some surprises, or coffee, alcohol. Then it's interesting that like some of the high protein animal foods, even ones that are generally associated with a healthy diet, low fat dairy or poultry, non-fatty fish, actually seem to be increased, or at least associated with increases levels of insulin. There is also a lot of overlap between pro-insulin and pro-inflammatory foods. But do these dietary patterns that are based on these specific markers and telling us anything really different from other dietary patterns? Well, at least in this example, I think they may be. But I show here are correlations between the EDIP, which is the inflammatory dietary pattern. Again, this is entirely empirically derived based on the foods that predict it, and this is the insulinemic pattern. And you can see correlations with standard dietaries, healthy eating index, Mediterranean DASH, but they're actually not that strongly correlated. The strongest here is with the insulinemic and an adverse correlation with healthy eating index. It's also with the empirical diets that I just talked about, the proven Western. Again, their correlations are not that strong except for the insulinemic diet and the Western diet. And so when we look, like for example, in the Nurses' Health Study, and this is one example, this has to be looked more broadly. So I don't want to make a general statement, but at least in this population, the dietary patterns that we formed empirically based on hypotheses, insulin, inflammation, are predictive of colon cancer in the Nurses' Health Study, whereas the Mediterranean healthy diet, healthy eating index, and DASH were not related to colon cancer in this population, which I think is interesting because it indicates that these diets do tell us something different. It's also a point, I think one of my first points is the importance of body weight and weight gain. And in the AICR-WCRF report, we note that a large part of the dietary effect on cancer is in helping to avoid weight gain and to maintain normal body weight over the life course. So when we look at dietary patterns, we have to also not just look at the dietary patterns in relation to cancer, the ones in relation to weight gain are also important. In fact, they could turn out to be the most important aspect of diet or dietary patterns in cancer. And I just kind of use this as kind of a conceptual example where we look at the dietary pattern and it may be important independently of energy affecting things like insulin, IGF, or inflammation. But these factors are also most strongly determined by adiposity, particularly visceral adiposity. So how the dietary pattern affects adiposity could turn out to be as important, if not more important, the direct effects of diet. If, for example, insulin and inflammation are key risk factors for cancer. So ultimately, I talked briefly about three main approaches, which are knowledge-based indices, which to date have been focused primarily in cardiovascular, the empirical based patterns, and the hypothesis-oriented patterns. And so I think ultimately we need to, as I also showed, there's some correlations among them, but they're not perfectly correlated by any means. So I think ultimately we have to determine what the common or shared attributes are and how they relate most directly to cancer. But we also can't really ignore other chronic diseases, particularly cardiovascular diseases. So we kind of have to integrate all this knowledge into a final package. And I think this is my final slide. Costas at the first session talked about the judging evidence for diet in general. And we're also determining how we're going to do this for dietary patterns for the AICR and WCRF. And this is tentative. We're still working on this, but each evidence for each type of dietary and lifestyle pattern can be evaluated separately. And meta-analyses is generally the preferred method for summarizing the data. But given the differences in the different dietary patterns, how they're defined, and what they mean in different populations, we probably more often will use a narrative synthesis with a synthetic summary, which identifies key findings or trends, potential reasons for observed variations, and strengths and limitations of the body of evidence. So this is, we'll do meta-analyses when feasible, but very often probably we'll have to rely on a narrative synthesis. And finally, as I've mentioned in the last slide, really the commonality of the data should be considered by taking into account the shared attributes among the diverse patterns, and the ones that are specifically consistently related to risk of certain cancers. Thank you, and I think we'll take questions at the end, if I understand correctly.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. Yes, we will be taking questions in the Q&A period at the end. In my haste at the beginning of this session, I completely forgot to introduce my co-host for the session, Dr. Wendy Demark Wanafried. And so she'll be introducing the next person. You're currently on mute.
Okay. The next speaker is Julie Obbagy, and she is, I won't talk about her great accomplishments. I'm just going to launch into the talk since time is of the essence. So Julie, take it away. Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Julie, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry, I seem to have lost control. Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to come speak with you all today. My name is Julie Obbagy, and I am a nutrition scientist with USDA's Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. And I served as the project lead for the systematic reviews that were conducted to help inform the latest edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So today, let's see if I can advance the slide. I can't seem to get it to advance. Let me see if I can. So today my job here is to give you all an overview of the newest edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which was released just a few weeks ago on December 29th. But my screen seems to be frozen and I can't advance the slide. So let me see if I can.
I want to try exiting the presentation mode and relaunching it.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, and it won't do that. I apologize for this. I've not had this problem before. Oh boy.
Yeah, I would move on to Melissa, but I think
I know.
your talk first.
I know. I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening. Let me see if I can reshare and if that will help me out.
Is this something maybe that Kirsty or Nigel could help with? Do we have your slides?
We do not currently have Dr. Obbagy's slides.
Okay.
So if you want to send them over to me really quickly, I'm happy to share my screen. I'm sorry that you're having these issues.
I know. I'm sorry. It seems to be totally frozen.
If we were doing this in person, we'd have some guy scurrying up.
I know. I'm so sorry, but let me see if I can get it to open. But in the meantime, I can provide just a little bit of the background about the guidelines that was on the first slide that I was intending to show. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans is the cornerstone for all federal nutrition programs and policies. It provides food-based recommendations to help prevent diet-related chronic diseases and promote overall health. And historically, the guidelines were focused on ages 2 and above, but the really exciting thing about the newest edition that was just released is that it now includes guidance for the entire lifespan. So it includes guidance for infants and toddlers as well as women who are pregnant and or lactating. And let me see if I can get this going again. I think. Great. Are you able to see my screen now?
No.
Uh-oh. How about?
Yeah, we're good now.
There we go.
Oh, good.
Yay.
You got it.
Excellent. Great. So let me get to the slide here. Great. So the guidelines are grounded in evidence. So the guidelines are mandated to reflect the preponderance of scientific evidence, and they're jointly, yes.
Could you put it into slide presentation mode? Because right now it's just in slide sorter.
Sure.
Thank you.
I don't know why it's doing this. It's just done it again. Oh, goodness.
I'm sorry. Maybe you should go back to where it was before.
I know it's, well, let me keep going and see if it will open again and we'll get it on the right screen. But the target audience of the guidelines themselves are health professionals and professionals who work with the general public. So the guidelines aren't directed towards the general public, but rather to the professionals who are helping them to consume a healthy diet, as well as to inform different policies and services that are designed to support healthy eating among the general public. I'm just going to try one more time.
We can see them, so if you can just, oh, there we
Okay.
go. Perfect.
Great.
Let's not mess with anything.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Great. So a hallmark of the development of the guidelines is the use of a federal advisory committee whose responsibility it is to review the evidence and then make recommendations to the government for what should be included in the guidelines. And this slide here shows our 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, made up of 20 nationally recognized experts from around the country who are nutrition scientists or medical doctors with a whole host of different expertise in food, nutrition, food science related topics, as well as health outcomes like cancer, cardiovascular disease, other chronic diseases, and with expertise in nutrition across the lifespan. And this committee had a special emphasis on expertise related to infants, toddlers, and women who are pregnant and or lactating. And I think it's also worth noting that the committee has a real range of methodological expertise as well, including trialists, epidemiologists, those with different data analysis technique expertise, and systematic review methodology. So the committee answered a number of different scientific questions related to diet and health using one of 3 different approaches that are listed here on this slide. They conducted a number of data analyses to describe the current health status and dietary intakes of Americans. They conducted food pattern modeling, which allowed them to see how changes to different components of the dietary pattern could impact one's ability to meet their nutrient needs. And then they also conducted a series of systematic reviews to look at the relationship between diet and health. And so I'd just like to pause here for a moment to focus on the systematic review work that was done related to dietary patterns because of the focus of this particular session, and just highlight those reviews that were done by the committee to look at dietary patterns, which I've shared a definition here on the slide, but Dr. Giovannucci did a really nice job of summarizing the kinds of research they were looking at in these reviews, really focusing on food and beverage-based dietary patterns. And they looked at a whole host of different outcomes that are listed here, some of which they looked at across the lifespan, some of which they looked at specifically as related to dietary patterns consumed during pregnancy and or lactation. And so I can't get into the work in depth today, but I'd love to direct you to our website, which is nesser.usda.gov, highlighted here on this slide, which has details about the committee's reviews on dietary patterns, including one they did on cancer, looking at breast, colorectal, lung, and prostate cancer. Also includes more information about our process to evaluate the evidence and conduct systematic reviews. So back to the guidelines themselves. Once the committee's report is completed and it's submitted to the departments, then a team of federal nutrition scientists is convened to draft the actual guidelines themselves, the policy document. And they do that using a number of different resources. They start with the 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines and then make any updates based on the committee's scientific report. They also consider other federal nutrition-related policy that's been published, as well as agency and public comments. And those draft guidelines go through several rounds of review and revision along the way, including a federal expert review, an external peer review, and then rounds of departmental clearance, which means the document goes through all of the federal agencies that have some sort of a nutrition programming aspect to them. So NIH, FDA, CDC, the Food and Nutrition Service, as well as FSIS, which focuses on food safety. So now I'd like to just provide a very brief overview of the 2020 to 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. There are 4 overarching guidelines that I'd like to just walk through today, but really I can only scratch the surface of what's in the guidelines themselves. The document is really full of extensive information that supports each of these guidelines. There's great pictures and figures throughout to help illustrate some of the concepts, and it really is an essential reference document to read and use as a resource. So the first guideline is to follow a healthy dietary pattern at every life stage, and this life stage approach really is a hallmark of this edition of the guidelines. The key recommendation here for individuals 12 months through older adulthood is to consume a healthy dietary pattern to meet nutrient needs, help achieve a healthy body weight, and reduce the risk of chronic disease. The other key recommendations are directed towards our youngest Americans, so those under 12 months of age, and they advise exclusive feeding of human milk for the first 6 months of life and recommend introducing nutrient-dense complementary foods along with potentially allergenic foods starting at about 6 months of age. So the second major guideline is to customize and enjoy nutrient-dense food and beverage choices to reflect personal preferences, cultural traditions, and budgetary considerations. This new edition really emphasizes that a healthy dietary pattern can benefit all Americans regardless of their age, their race or ethnicity, or current health status, and that the dietary guidelines really is intended to provide a framework of what types of foods and food groups should be consumed, but then it's intended to be tailored and customized to individual needs and preferences and sort of the diverse foodways of those living in the United States. So guideline 3, and I think this will look very familiar to some of the presentations you saw earlier this morning about guidelines that AICR and WCRF support. But guideline 3 is to focus on meeting food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages and to stay within calorie limits. So the list of sort of the core elements of what make up a healthy dietary pattern are shown on the right side of the slides. Vegetables of all types, fruits, grains, especially whole grains, dairy, lean meat, poultry, protein foods, and oils. And really these core elements of a healthy dietary pattern are very consistent across the life stage. Also important to this guideline is the concept of nutrient density or nutrient-dense foods or beverages. And that's defined on the slide. I've tried to bold that a little bit, but those are foods that provide vitamins, minerals, and other health-promoting components, but also have no or little added sugars, saturated fats, or sodium. So if I move to this next slide, it's a really great visual in the guidelines that helps illustrate the amount of calories needed to meet food group recommendations healthfully. So with foods and beverages in nutrient-dense forms, there's about 85% of your calories that should be earmarked for those nutrient-dense healthy choices. But what that also means is that only about 15%, or about 250 to 350 calories for the average individual, are left for other uses. And by other uses, we mean consuming more nutrient-dense foods and beverages, but also including things like added sugars, saturated fat, or an alcoholic beverage into your dietary pattern. And so that leads to the fourth major guideline, which is to limit foods and beverages higher in added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium, and to limit alcoholic beverages. And there are some specific quantitative recommendations that are shown here on the right side of the slide For added sugar, intake should be less than 10% of calories per day starting at age 2. And specifically, those who are younger than age 2 should avoid foods and beverages with added sugars. Saturated fat is similar, less than 10% of calories per day starting at age 2. For sodium, limit intake to less than 2,300 milligrams per day, and even less for children under age 14, corresponding with the dietary reference intakes or DRIs for sodium. And then lastly, for adults of legal drinking age who choose to drink, doing so in moderation. So that would mean limiting intake to 2 drinks a day or less for men and 1 drink or a day or less for women. And the guidelines really emphasize that drinking less is better for health than drinking more, and that there are some adults who should avoid drinking altogether, such as women who are pregnant. So the remaining chapters of the guidelines are really tailored to specific guidance for certain life stage groups. So there's chapters each for infants and toddlers, children and adolescents, adults, women who are pregnant or lactating, as well as older adults. And each one of these chapters provides an overview of the healthy US-style dietary pattern that's sort of specific for that life stage. It provides an overview of current intakes as compared to recommendations. And then it also includes a nice discussion of special dietary considerations unique to that particular life stage, as well as resources that can be used to support healthy eating for that life stage, with an emphasis on highlighting food assistance programs and nutrition education programs that can be utilized to support a particular population group. And then finally, I'd like to just highlight a few websites where you can get more information. Dietaryguidelines.gov is obviously the main place to visit. You can get the new edition and some of the online only supporting materials, as well as information about the process used to develop the guidelines, including the 2020 committee's scientific report. I'd also put a plug in for nesser.usda.gov, again, which is the website that we place all of the systematic reviews conducted to inform the guidelines, including all of those on dietary patterns that I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, My Plate is a great resource for consumer-based materials around healthy eating. So bottom line, for lifelong good health, make every bite count with the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, and just a brief acknowledgement of the many, many people who supported the development of this edition of the guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. As I said before, we'll hold Q&A till the end. So moving right along, as we're running a little behind, I'd like to introduce Melissa Maitin-Shepard, who is a public policy consultant for the AICR, and she'll be chatting to us today about making dietary guidelines count.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me?
We can.
Great. Hi, again, I'm Melissa Maitin-Shepard. I'm pleased to be speaking along such an esteemed group of experts. I am a public policy consultant for AICR, and I will be talking about our work on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2020 to 2025 that Dr. Obbagy just talked about, that was released in late 2020. So my presentation will cover 3 topics. First, how AICR engaged in the development of the Dietary Guidelines. Second, I'll briefly compare the Dietary Guidelines with AICR's 10 cancer prevention recommendations that you also heard about earlier this morning, and then also explain why it matters, what the Dietary Guidelines say, and why public policy is important for cancer prevention. So AICR has 3 goals in engaging in the Dietary Guidelines update process. First was to influence the development of the guidelines so that they address cancer and more closely align with AICR's 10 cancer prevention recommendations. Second was to elevate AICR as a respected resource for government decision makers and for other stakeholders in the policy space. And then third, in forums like this, to educate how the Dietary Guidelines align with AICR's recommendations. So this visual shows the timeline for the 2020 to 2025 Dietary Guidelines update process. By law, the Dietary Guidelines must be updated every 5 years based on the preponderance of evidence at the time, and it is a multi-year process with multiple opportunities for public input. One of the major steps in the process is highlighted by the second arrow here, and it's the review of the evidence by the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which Dr. Obbagy talked about. They're a committee of external scientific experts who are leaders in the field. And during about the year and a half that they completed their work, they held 6 public meetings to publicly discuss their work, and there was also an ongoing opportunity for public comment. So AICR took full advantage of that public comment opportunity and submitted multiple written comment letters on their evidence review process and the advisory committee's draft recommendations. We provided oral comments, we met with federal staff, and collaborated with other advocates on these activities as well. And then following the release of the advisory committee's scientific report in the summer of 2020, AICR again engaged in multiple ways to inform the development of the dietary guidelines by the federal staff. AICR had several recommendations for the advisory committee, and I've highlighted some of them here. We recommended with respect to the evidence reviews that the committee utilize existing high-quality systematic reviews and meta-analyses that were conducted by researchers outside of the federal government, such as AICR, and this was a recommendation that more than 30 organizations also endorsed. We asked that they consider the evidence on dietary patterns, obesity, and cancer risk, and make recommendations that align with AICR's cancer prevention recommendations. With respect to alcohol, we asked that the committee prioritize their planned review on alcohol and cancer, which ultimately did not get completed due to time considerations. And we asked that the committee reach a conclusion and make recommendations that align with AICR's recommendations with respect to cancer prevention. And then also, as Dr. Obbagy mentioned, this was the first time that the dietary guidelines provided recommendations for young children under age 2 and pregnant and lactating women. We recommended that the committee acknowledge the benefits for cancer protection of breastfeeding for both the mother and the child. We also had a set of recommendations for the dietary guidelines policy report itself. And as we heard from Dr. Obbagy, the dietary guidelines address dietary patterns and use a life course approach, which AICR strongly supported. We recommended that the guidelines emphasize mostly plant-based foods with limits on unhealthful components, which the guidelines do largely as well. As had been mentioned earlier, we emphasize that the greatest benefits come from following the guidelines as a package rather than as individual guidelines. And then AICR also commented on 2 of the more high-profile recommendations in the advisory committee's report. One was with respect to added sugar, and recommended that the committee recommended that added sugars be limited to 6% of calories, which is a decrease from the current 10% limit, and also that males reduce their alcohol intake to no more than 1 drink per day on days when alcohol is consumed, which is more closely aligned with AICR's recommendation that it's best not to drink alcohol for cancer prevention. And unfortunately, those 2 recommendations ultimately were not included in the final report. So I do want to briefly highlight how engagement in the dietary guidelines development process has helped to amplify AICR's research. And it's important to note that all of our recommendations to the advisory committee reflect the evidence in the CUP reports and the cancer prevention recommendations. And we also worked with a small group of leading researchers to craft the specific comments to the advisory committee and to the federal staff on the dietary guidelines. And while the dietary guidelines don't exactly reflect AICR's recommendations in all areas, they are largely aligned, and we do feel that we were successful in educating federal stakeholders and the public who may not have previously been familiar with AICR or their guidelines or AICR's recommendations prior to engagement in this process. But also the earned media was a huge success. That's not a typo there. There were more than 600 million media impressions that mentioned AICR following the release of the dietary guidelines through online and radio, including many of the top online news publications. So AICR clearly got its name out there with respect to engagements in the dietary guidelines process. Now I'm going to briefly switch gears and highlight how the new dietary guidelines compare with AICR's cancer prevention recommendations. Dr. Obbagy already presented on the dietary guidelines, so I'm going to skip most of this slide, but I do want to emphasize at a high level, there is a lot of consistency between the dietary guidelines and AICR's recommendations, including the focus on the life course approach, the focus on nutrient-dense foods and beverages and dietary patterns, the importance of staying within calorie limits, and limiting unhealthful dietary components. But it's also important to note that a key difference is that AICR's recommendations are specific to cancer prevention, whereas the dietary guidelines are for overall health. So AICR's #1 recommendation focuses on body weight, and AICR notes that having a healthy weight is one of the most important ways to protect from cancer. And while the dietary guidelines doesn't have a specific recommendation dedicated to body weight, it certainly is addressed in several recommendations. With respect to recommended dietary pattern, AICR emphasizes plant-based foods, including whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and legumes that are underconsumed in the population and are important for cancer prevention. The dietary guidelines takes a broader approach in outlining the core elements of a healthy dietary pattern, which also includes fruits and vegetables and grains. And the guidelines note that at least half should be whole grains. And protein foods, which include plant-based proteins, but also a broader group of protein foods. So both AICR and the dietary guidelines have a plate that provides a visual representation of what a healthy dietary pattern should look like. And you'll see AICR New American Plate emphasizes that 2/3 of the plate should be plant foods like whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and beans. And my plate on the right recommends that half of the plate be fruits and vegetables, so some consistency there. But then with respect to the other components, grains, proteins, and dairy, the visual representation is not as clear as to the nutritional quality of the other components, although there is additional information about that provided on the My Plate website and their resources. With respect to foods and components to limit, AICR's recommendation addresses ultra-processed foods with excess fats, starches, and sugars, while the dietary guidelines provides quantitative limits for added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. And as I had noted, the recommendations for added sugars and saturated fat did not change since the 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines, despite recommendations for added sugars from the to change the recommendation for added sugars from the advisory committee. And AICR's recommendations do not have quantitative limits, but instead are food-based. So AICR recommends limiting intake of red meats and avoiding processed meats, while in contrast, the dietary guidelines encourages consumption of lean meats as part of a protein foods group, which is one of the core elements of a healthy dietary pattern. However, the protein foods section of the dietary guidelines does note that most meat should be in unprocessed forms. So AICR includes an explicit recommendation to limit consumption of sugar-sweetened drinks and to drink water or unsweetened drinks instead, as sugar-sweetened beverages are the leading source of added sugars in the US, providing about 1/4 of all calories from added sugars. There isn't a top-line recommendation for limiting added sugars as part of the dietary guidelines, but this certainly is addressed for every age group as part of the added sugar recommendations. AICR has a strong recommendation for alcohol and notes that for cancer prevention, it is best not to drink alcohol at all. And the dietary guidelines, the advisory committee had proposed to change the recommended limit. And the dietary guidelines, as I had said, from 2 drinks per day to no more than 1 drink per day for men, based in large part on the evidence of increased cancer risk. The final dietary guidelines carries forward the recommendation from the prior dietary guidelines, but does note that drinking less is better for health than drinking more. With respect to supplements, both AICR and the dietary guidelines recommend meeting nutrient needs primarily through foods, although supplements may be warranted in specific circumstances, but not for cancer prevention. With respect to lactation, both AICR and the dietary guidelines recommend breastfeeding, and the dietary guidelines specifies the ideal duration of human milk feeding, and that's consistent with recommendations from the World Health Organization and the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it is noteworthy that this is the first time the dietary guidelines provided recommendations for pregnant and lactating women and for children under age 2. For cancer survivors, AICR recommends that cancer survivors also try to follow the recommendations if they can. The dietary guidelines state that they are focused on disease prevention rather than treatment. So they do not address Americans with diet-related chronic disease, although they do note that there are a large number of Americans with diet-related chronic disease. That's just not their purpose. Their purpose is for focus on disease prevention. So I'll conclude by considering why the dietary guidelines are important and why we care how they align with AICR's recommendations. So as I noted, federal law requires that all federal food and nutrition policies, programs, and messages promote the dietary guidelines. And I've included just a few examples here of the programs that are based on the dietary guidelines. We all need to eat foods, and we all are impacted by federal food and nutrition policies or programs in some way. And in addition to their uses within the federal government, the dietary guidelines are also used by non-federal entities as evidence-based guidance. And it's important that the dietary guidelines reflect the evidence on cancer, because getting people to follow evidence-based cancer prevention guidelines is crucial to our nation's health and to our economic well-being. And I've included just a few stats here about both the health and economic implications of the current status of cancer in our country. So unfortunately, most people do not follow either the dietary guidelines or AICR's recommendations, and that's not fully their fault. There are many things working against us. There need to be more changes in policies, environments, and systems that make healthy foods more accessible, affordable, convenient, tasty, and promoted. And there needs to be more access to information and resources, such as services of a registered dietitian. And I'd be happy to address during the closing session what AICR is doing to advocate for policy changes that address these issues. So in conclusion, if the policy work piqued your interest, or if you'd like to know more or get more involved in amplifying AICR's investment in research through public policy change, please sign up on our website. I've included the link there. You can find it under the Impact tab, or you are welcome to contact me or Kirsty Kiefer at AICR, who's also involved in our policy work. So in conclusion, thank you for your time. I provided my contact information here. I would also be happy to take any questions now or at the concluding session later in the day.
Okay, thank you to all of the speakers. You gave great talks and lots to think about as we move forward. We have a few minutes for questions here, and I think we'll start by maybe a pressing question for healthcare practitioners. And so it's a question for both Melissa and Julie. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap between the different guidelines. There are some discrepancies, though. So how does a healthcare practitioner navigate between the two and decide which advice to give?
I'll start. I think a key difference in the guidelines is that AICR's recommendations are specific for cancer prevention, whereas the dietary guidelines address overall health. I think there are more similarities than there are differences. I did bring attention to a few of the differences just to highlight where they differ, but I think overall, as a whole, the dietary patterns that are recommended by both are very similar. And so I would certainly suggest focusing on the similarities and note that AICR's is specific to cancer prevention, whereas the dietary guidelines address overall health more broadly.
I wanted to, as a chair of the session, I do want to press a little bit further because, and a lot of our listening audience has some concerns about issues such as lean meats and perhaps, and there was kind of a blistering article in the New York Times about the dietary guidelines not perhaps going as far as the science says we can go. And so I just, maybe in the future, how can we tackle this problem? Because as Melissa pointed out, these guidelines do feed into policy and can affect the most number of Americans. And I'd like Julie to answer that.
Yeah, I think first I would echo what Melissa said just a moment ago, that there really is a lot of similarities between the dietary guidelines and the guidelines recommended for cancer prevention through AICR. And, you know, really, I feel very confident that the guidelines process and the development of the guidelines process is very rigorous, very science-based, and very transparent. And I think that moving forward, we will only continue to support that focus on the evidence. From a dietary patterns research perspective, I do think some of what Dr. Giovannucci alluded to is something we can look forward to in the future, is looking for research that more specifically gets at some of the nuances within the food groups. Often the patterns focus on kind of the overarching food groups without getting into some of the more nuanced differences in cooking method or preparation method or processing. And so it'd be really great for future research to be able to tease out some more of the components of the patterns and be able to incorporate that into the review process in future editions of the guidelines.
And I would add that I think that a challenge with the dietary guidelines development process is that the advisory committee's review of the evidence and issuance of the report is very scientific. And then after that process, the development of the policy report is done by officials at USDA and HHS, and it is mostly done behind the scenes, and it's not transparent, although this edition did provide an explanation why they did not take the advisory committee's recommendations on added sugars and alcohol. There is certainly some politics that is injected into that process. And so from an outsider's advocacy perspective, it would be ideal for that process to be more transparent and for the guidelines to be fully driven by the review of the evidence. I think that is where there is an opportunity for special interests to provide their perspective, and certainly the guidelines are largely consistent with the evidence, but it's clear that there are some differences between the advisory committee's report and what's in the final guidelines that I think are not fully explained by the evidence, at least on the evidence with respect to cancer prevention from AICR's perspective.
Okay. Well, I wish we could go on for a long time here. However, we can't. The session has ended. We do have a general panel discussion at 2:30, or I'm sorry, here. Let me look at my schedule. 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. I'm in Alabama, so I'm off schedule here, but I hope to see many of you back again, because I think we could have a very rich discussion at that point in time. I want to thank our speakers, and I want to thank our audience, and maybe we can address some of these questions at that time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.